Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to share this week's story with you because it is one of my very favorite stories in the Bible. But before we get to the story, I have a question for you. Have you ever been asked to do something that you thought was too difficult for you to do? Well, today we will learn about a time when God helped his people when they were facing a difficult and dangerous situation. Through this story, we can remember that even when we feel alone or it seems no one is able to help us, God is always there. In fact, the Bible tells us that God is our help in times of trouble. Today, we are starting a new unit, which means we have a new big picture question. It's helpful to have a big picture question to help us understand how this story fits into the big story of the Bible. This unit's question is about control. We can't control everything. However, there is someone who is in control of everything. Who is in control of everything? God is in control of everything in heaven and on earth. Long before our story took place, God made a promise to Abraham. God chose Abraham to become the father of a great nation, the nation of Israel. God promised that through Abraham's family, God would bless the entire world. For hundreds of years, the Israelites battled against sin. Sometimes they followed God, but most of the time, they were unfaithful to him. Eventually, God disciplined the people by exiling them to Babylon. God promised that after 70 years in captivity, the Israelites would finally return to their home. Now, we've learned that the captives came home and the temple was rebuilt. But not all of God's people returned to Israel. Some stayed in the nation of Persia. And that's where our story picks up today. You can find this story in the Old Testament book of Esther. Take a look.
King Ahasuerus was the king of Persia. Many years earlier, when Cyrus was king, he sent some of God's people back to Judah to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Some of God's people stayed in Persia. God's people were called Jews because they were from Judah. The king of Persia chose Esther to be his queen. Esther didn't tell the king that she was a Jew. One day, Mordecai heard that Haman, an important leader who worked for the king, was planning to kill all the Jews. Mordecai was upset. He was a Jew. He didn't want all the people he loved to be killed. Mordecai and all the Jews cried. Esther didn't know what was wrong. She sent a messenger to ask Mordecai why all the Jews were upset. Mordecai told Esther about Haman's evil plan. "You have to do something," Mordecai said. "Ask the king to stop Haman. Ask him to save the Jewish people." Esther sent a message back to Mordecai. "No one can approach the king unless the king calls for that person first," Esther said. "The punishment is death. Unless the king holds out his scepter, then you may live." "You're a Jew," Mordecai said. "If you don't stop Haman, he will kill you too. Maybe this is why you are the queen. Maybe God put Esther in the palace to save her people." Esther asked Mordecai and the Jews to fast for 3 days. Then Esther would go to the king, even if it meant she might die. On the 3rd day, Esther went to the king. He saw Esther and held out his golden scepter. "What is it, Queen Esther?" the king asked. "What do you want to ask me? I'll give you anything, up to half of my kingdom." Esther said, "Would you and Haman come to a feast today?" So Haman and the king went to Esther's feast. After eating, the king said, "What do you want, Queen Esther? I'll give you anything, up to half of my kingdom." "Come to my feast tomorrow," Esther said. The king agreed. The next day, Haman and the king went to Esther's feast. After eating, the king said, "What do you want, Queen Esther? I'll give you anything, up to half my kingdom." Esther spoke up. "There is a plan to kill me and my people." The king replied, "Who is responsible for this plan?" "This evil enemy, Haman," Esther said. The king was angry. He punished Haman and made a law to keep the Jewish people safe from their enemies.
Wow! Can you imagine being in Esther's shoes? She showed a lot of bravery in approaching the king. She could have been killed. Esther was in a hard situation and was probably afraid, but she had faith in God. Even when she wasn't sure what God's plan was, she trusted him. God had a plan for Esther and for his people. God's plan was to send Jesus through the family of Judah. God can't be caught by surprise. His plans cannot be stopped. Who is in control of everything? God is in control of everything in heaven and on earth. Esther's life reminds us of Jesus, who was also willing to die to save God's people according to God's plan. Let's watch.
God was in control over Haman's evil plan to destroy the Jews. Like Haman, Satan wants to ruin God's plan and destroy believers. Satan thought he had won when Jesus died on the cross, but God raised Jesus from the dead and defeated Satan once and for all. All who believe in Jesus are rescued from sin and death.
Just like God had a plan for Esther to protect the Jewish people, God has a plan for each of us. We don't know exactly what our future will look like, but we can trust that God does. Our new key passage for this unit is 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10. Let's read it together. "The God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, establish, strengthen, and support you after you have suffered a little while." This verse describes God as the God of all grace. God shows us favor and love we do not deserve. God doesn't promise that we will never suffer, but he does promise to restore us and strengthen us. The Jews would have died at the hands of Haman, but God protected them through Esther's bravery. God showed them grace and kindness by keeping them safe from Haman's evil plan. No matter what we are facing, we can be sure that God will strengthen and support us by his wonderful grace. I hope you know that God has a plan for your life, even though his plan might not always seem obvious. In our Bible story today, we see that God made Esther a queen to protect his people. Esther didn't realize that at first. One day, we will understand God's plans and see that everything he did was for his glory and our good. Until then, we can put our hope and trust in the God of all grace. I'll see you next time.